This is the story of The Tale of Benjamin Bunny, and it was written by Beatrix Potter. And if you haven't looked at the video yet with The Tale of Peter Rabbit, you need to look at that one first because this story relates to that. It has similar characters, and this one is meant to be read after that one is. And I want to remind you that these stories were written a very long time ago, and so they'll make reference to like a cart instead of cars and trucks because that was back when people rode horses or drove buggies and wagons and things. So anyway, here's The Tale of Benjamin Bunny, written way back in 1904. That just the cutest little bunny you ever saw. One morning, a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trick-trot of a pony. A gig, which is a kind of a wagon, was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skip, and jump to call upon his relations, who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. You remember we heard about them before. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffatees. I once bought a pair at a bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. There's their very neat little home. And there's Benjamin Bunny watching the wagon go by. And there's old Mrs. Rabbit and three of the bunnies. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back. He must be wanting to be sneaky for some reason. That's why he doesn't want to see her. It's not because she's mean or anything, but she's a grown-up, and I think she's going to get in the way of whatever trouble he's brewing out. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. It must have been a person's pocket handkerchief, so it was pretty big on a little rabbit. Peter, said little Benjamin in a whisper, who has got your clothes? Mr. McGregor's garden, Peter replied. The scarecrow is wearing them, and he described how he had been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped that it would rain. He's being mean because he knows they're out in a buggy and they don't have any cover. He hopes that the rain will rain on them and maybe ruin her bonnet. He's not a very nice little rabbit. At this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard inside the rabbit hole, calling, Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more chamomile. That's a kind of plant to make tea out of. Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam-o'-shanter of Mr. McGregor's. That's a kind of a beret-type hat. There's Peter having to wear a handkerchief like a blanket because he doesn't have any clothes because he lost them. And there they are sneaking around looking in Mr. McGregor's garden. Little Benjamin said, it spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree. Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence. The bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with lettuces. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam-o'-shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. I think he's still scared from almost getting caught by Mr. McGregor before. We know that Peter's father got killed by Mr. McGregor and baked into a pie, so I can see why he would be nervous. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was Old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. So he's named after his father. He's young Benjamin, or little Benjamin. So, a lot of very nice pictures here. There's Peter falling headfirst out of the pear tree into the lettuce patch. There they are making little footprints all over the garden, including clog prints. There's Benjamin trying on Mr. McGregor's hat from the scarecrow, but it's kind of big and floppy on him. There they are gathering onions, and you can see they're using the handkerchief. They're going to wrap them up in the handkerchief like a bag to take the onions. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said that he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half the onions. He's not himself yet, is he? Little Benjamin said that it was not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly to the other end of the garden. They went along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorsteps cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently Peter let the pocket handkerchief go again. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousin when he suddenly stopped. This is what those rabbits saw around that corner. Little Benjamin took one look, then in half a minute, less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. They are walking with dropping the onions. He keeps dropping them and they have to pick them up. They're walking along the path. There he is. He drops the onions again because he sees something scary. He picked them up. That's what they see. There's a big cat. That is not a friend of those rabbits. The cat got up and stretched herself and came and sniffed at the basket. Remember, they're hiding underneath. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down on the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was fearful, it made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Ooh, I bet that little switch is to maybe spank Benjamin for being gone too long. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatsoever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall onto the top of the cat and cuffed it off the basket and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. He's a pretty ferocious rabbit, isn't he? The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with a little switch. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. He is not a happy camper, Papa. Boys that are places they're not supposed to be. There's the cat sitting on top of the basket for 5 hours. And there's old Mr. Benjamin Bunny with the little switch to spank with. And there he is leaping down and fighting with the cat. And there he is spanking Benjamin and then sending the boys off. When Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, it's a good thing they got out of there. They didn't have much time, did they? He observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs. Only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling, with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. The end. There's old Mr. McGregor looking at his garden and trying to figure out what on earth happened there. And there's old Mrs. Bunny, and she's hung up the onions and she's rocking the babies. And Peter and his brother Cottontail are folding up the handkerchief.